Hello there, everyone. I am your host, the Sea Monster, and I welcome you all to a somewhat unscripted video where I give a final assessment on what I would consider to be Phase 1 of the MonsterVerse, which means we would be making a final assessment on the string of MonsterVerse films that consist of Godzilla 2014, Kong Skull Island, Godzilla King of the Monsters 2019, and Godzilla vs. Kong. Considering I've already done a lengthy essay video series on each of these four films, I figured the best way to start this would just be a summary of what I've discussed about those films. I basically have considered the MonsterVerse films, at least the four that we've gotten so far, to be pretty good, if not great, at least for the most part. Godzilla 2014 has some really strong character work, perhaps even underappreciated, especially in the part of Ford Brody, Aaron Taylor Johnson's character, along with some great set pieces with amazing special effects. While not a flawless film by any stretch, especially once we get to the third act, which features the nuclear bomb plot element that's used in the climax just for the sake of increasing tension and suspense, despite being redundant, Godzilla 2014 still holds up overall in terms of objective quality. Kong Skull Island, while not as thematically deep as 2014, still holds up in terms of having some good characters for the most part, especially from Hank Marlowe, John C. Reilly's character, and Colonel Packard, Samuel L. Jackson's character, and some really well done action, while also giving us a pretty good introduction to this universe's iteration of Kong, even if some of the effects in the film don't really quite hold up as well as others. And then we have Godzilla King of the Monsters, which holds up in just about every aspect, from the action set pieces that give us a really strong sense of scale of the monsters, maintaining what 2014 was able to do while also expanding on it, such as certain points of views, from human characters witnessing the monster battles from their POV, the monsters themselves being very well characterized, the effects being very well done for the most part, and the story and character work throughout the film being very strong, through and through. So now we're left with Godzilla vs. Kong, which I want to do an addendum on the most, in terms of this final assessment, as I do have some new thoughts that have sort of gestated as I've thought about it since I did the essay video series. There's certainly been a discussion on whether or not Godzilla vs. Kong holds up in terms of objective quality, and there's definitely people around there that have sort of formed camps, more particularly a camp that says that the film doesn't hold up very well. And I will admit, there are some flaws in GVK's plot that are kind of worth addressing, which I never really quite did in my essay video series, mainly because they didn't really cross my mind. So even though I'll be adding this final assessment video to the playlist for all my essay video series in the MonsterVerse, at least of the first four films, this one's primarily going to focus on GVK for a little bit. Now, over time, I've gotten around to watching more of a series of videos called Godzilla vs. Kong, A Great Sadness, from fellow kaiju tuber C. Animus, where he pretty much broke down and critiqued Godzilla vs. Kong, and he brought up some points that I hadn't even quite considered, such as how Skull Island, in terms of geography, had seemed to have been somewhat relocated from Kong Skull Island to Godzilla vs. Kong. While it may not be the most significant retcon imaginable, I can kind of see where he's coming from, especially if the film were to be consistent with the rest of MonsterVerse, or at least what was established in Kong Skull Island. Another point which he brought up in his Great Sadness series, which I also happen to sort of agree with to some extent, is the underdevelopment of the characters from Apex Cybernetics, particularly Walter Simmons, played by Damian Bashir, and Ren Sarazawa. I pretty much agree that Ren Sarazawa was sort of underutilized and could have used like a bit more of a direct connection to Dr. Ishiro Sarazawa, Ken Watanabe's character from the previous entries, and how him sort of dying before he even got any sort of like strong character growth or motive led to some missed opportunities. And as far as Walter Simmons goes, well, I do kind of agree that he's not as deep as he could have been, or perhaps should have been. I would safely say that he's not completely without motive. He pretty much wants humanity to be the apex species once again, possibly due to some level of xenophobia towards Titans, especially Godzilla. And that xenophobia towards Titans led him to create Mechagodzilla, which would ultimately spell his demise when he was using the Ghidorah skull. Now, the thing that I do think could have been elaborated on is how he got the Ghidorah skull. At least like a mention of him getting it from someone like Alan Jonah, Charles Dance's character from King of the Monsters. Especially considering how Alan Jonah deals in the black market involving Titan-related stuff, and that he already had the decapitated head of Kevin from King of the Monsters after it was acquired from Isla de Mara. And considering that Walter Simmons would had to have worked on Mechagodzilla at some point between the events of 2014 and 2024, the latter date being when Godzilla vs. Kong takes place, him and Apex would had to have gotten the Ghidorah head from somewhere, or someone. And it's likely that Mechagodzilla's construction was commissioned before he was even given the official word to move forward with putting a weapon out without the government or anyone noticing for a while. Now, what I'm saying is that the film easily could have established Walter Simmons having gotten the Ghidorah head from Alan Jonah through some kind of underground deal. However, since the film didn't really make that clear, the best that I can say is that it's something that can at least be inferred. Perhaps a bit of steel manning, but there's at least a foundation there which can at least be arguable. Now, of course, if a future installment like, let's say Godzilla X Kong the New Empire were to establish something completely different as to how Walter Simmons and Apex Cybernetics got the Ghidorah skull for whatever reason, that may or may not actually make more sense than what I've just said, then that'll be one thing. But if it comes up with something that makes even less sense than what I've established, then that's pretty bad. But for now, all I can do in order to defend how Walter Simmons was able to get the Ghidorah head that Ren Serizawa uses to pilot Mechagodzilla is to pretty much infer that he may have done some rather shady business practices in order to get this done. And it's not like Godzilla vs. Kong doesn't show Walter Simmons in a negative light to some degree. But there is one point that I kind of overlooked, that C. Animus pointed out in his string of videos, that I didn't even think of. But now that I have, we have some talking to do. So we know that there's the one Ghidorah head in the room where Ren Serizawa pilots Mechagodzilla, right? But then it turns out Bernie Hayes goes on to establish that Ghidorah's three heads speak to each other telepathically in order to get stuff done, right? So then he goes on to say there's one Ghidorah head in this room, and there's one Ghidorah head in Mechagodzilla. So now this begs the question, where did the second head come from? Because there was never any point in Godzilla King of the Monsters 2019 or any previous MonsterVerse films that have established that there was a second Ghidorah head somewhere. In King of the Monsters, we only see the one Ghidorah head getting decapitated and replaced, and then later on, at the rest of the film, we have Burning Godzilla essentially disintegrating all of Ghidorah, leaving no trace remaining. And obviously, Godzilla 2014 and Kong Skull Island don't have any references to a second Ghidorah head lying around outside of Kevin's decapitated head, mainly because, well, Ghidorah was never even established in either of those two films except for the post-credits scene in Kong Skull Island, and even then, that's a cave painting. So where did Apex Cybernetics get the second Ghidorah head from? It'd be one thing if they said that they used Kevin's head to be a pilot source, and they established a satellite uplink as being like Mechagodzilla being powered up remotely, like from some biomechanical engineering sort of thing. Then that'd be one thing. But they didn't. Instead, Bernie Hayes establishes that there was a second Ghidorah head inside Mechagodzilla in order for the telepathic link to occur. But again, we never see anything from the previous three MonsterVerse films to establish that there was a second Ghidorah head found by Apex Cybernetics anywhere. And no, I should not be going towards theory videos or novelizations or prequel comics in order to figure all this out. It should be in the film if there was an answer. Now, you could say that Bernie Hayes is potentially like just theorizing, seeing as how he himself didn't even see the second Ghidorah head in Mechagodzilla either, assuming that there even is one. But even then, at what point do we pretty much start saying, oh, should we take any characters on their word whatsoever? Like, should we believe anything a certain character says at this point? Where does something like that begin or end, pretty much? Like, are we pretty much supposed to just say that Bernie Hayes is an unreliable narrator? there's some problems here. This kind of raises some questions about GVK, I'm not gonna lie. That being said, after having recently revisited Godzilla vs. Kong, it's a movie that I still find myself having a lot of fun with. I think it's a very entertaining movie overall. There are some very questionable physics that happen in some of the action scenes in the movie, but even then, I can pretty much let it go for the most part. At least personally. I acknowledge that it's there, but for me personally, I find Godzilla vs. Kong to be very entertaining, even knowing the flaws in it. I certainly won't call it the strongest entry in the MonsterVerse, not by any stretch. And I certainly agree that there's parts of Godzilla vs. Kong's plot that are very questionable and even kind of flimsy or underdeveloped, but it's still way better than a lot of what we see from Toho in terms of its Reiwa era as of late. So, yeah, there is that. So anyway, that pretty much draws this unscripted final assessment video to a close. I consider the MonsterVerse, at least Phase 1, to be a very worthwhile venture. While not perfect by any stretch, certainly from some installments as far as certain creative decisions that occur in them, I definitely consider it to be a very solid Phase 1 of the MonsterVerse. And it has me to look forward to what we have coming up in the next phase of MonsterVerse content, for better or for worse. So I'd like to thank you all very much for watching this video and for sticking around. As far as what I'll be doing next, well, I'll be sure to signpost you all on that when the news comes. Once again, thank you all for watching. Until the next video or series of videos, I will see you all later.